Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll get started in about 5 minutes, so just be patient. Thank you. Hi, everyone. We're just experiencing a little technical difficulty, but we'll just get started in just one moment. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for bearing with us. We're just having a couple of technical difficulties, but we're ironing them out and should be ready to go in a couple of minutes. Sorry about that.
Thank you guys so much for bearing with us. We're going to get started now very quickly. Please feel free to use the chat box at any time and ask questions, and we'll also leave time at the end to ask questions. The webinar will also be recorded and archived online. So today we're going to be discussing the Food, Energy, Water Nexus, connecting science and policy. My name is Brittany Webster, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's panel. And we have some exciting speakers, including Paolo D'Odorico from the University of California, Berkeley, Jenny Adam from Washington State University, and Lauren Schapker from the National Groundwater Association. And joining me as well here at AGU is my colleague Nancy Bombay, who's going to be helping me field your questions today. And with that, we'll jump right in. And just to give you a rundown of the speakers, what the speakers are going to cover today, Paolo will cover the global food, energy, water nexus. Jenny will talk about increasing resilience across the food, energy, water sectors in the Columbia River Basin. And then Lauren will finish us off by talking about perspectives from Washington dealing with the food, energy, water nexus. And now I will turn it over to Paolo.
Yeah, we start with looking at the food, energy, water nexus at the global scale, and we first need to remind ourselves that most of the human appropriation of water resources is by agriculture, and that in particular is for food production. So most of can you see me, or can you see the slides?
Yeah, Paolo, I think you need to accept sharing your screen. There you go.
Yeah,
oh, there we go.
Sorry.
Yep.
I didn't realize. Yeah. Are we good now?
Perfect.
Okay, very good. So the focus of my part of this seminar will be on the global aspects of the food, energy, water nexus. And as I was saying, most of the water used by human societies is in agriculture, and mainly for food production. In fact, if we look at our water footprint, most of it is for food and not for drinking. Agriculture uses two different types of water. So if it's a rain-fed agriculture, it uses water from precipitation that infiltrates into the ground and is taken up by plants from the root zone. And in addition to this, since the antiquity, farmers have been increasing their yields through irrigation. So we apply an additional amount of water. And there is a difference between these two different types of water. In rain-fed agriculture, we use the so-called green water, which is water present in the soil moisture in the root zone. Instead, in irrigated agriculture, we use, in addition to the green water that is applied through irrigation is taken from streams, rivers, lakes, or aquifers. That's usually defined as blue water. And that water can be placed in pipes, transferred, and used also for other uses not related to agriculture. So if we look at the total water used for agriculture, we obtain this big number, which is circled here in red. And corresponds to, I placed on the left hand side a very naive representation of the global water cycle, just to give a sense of the magnitude of the numbers we are talking about. So basically, the total water use for agriculture corresponds to about 10% of the precipitation over land, and 16% of the total evapotranspiration from all ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems. So agroecosystems take 16% of the terrestrial evapotranspiration. These are big numbers if we consider the fact that many regions around the world are not suitable for agriculture. So the question is whether we can meet the increasing demand for food, and to what extent the production of food is going to be limited by the availability of water resources. I said increasing demand, and there are different factors that contribute to this increase in demand. One of them is the increase in the global population. Every 12 years, we add another billion people to the planet. In addition to this is that even the per capita consumption has been increasing, particularly because of changes in diets. We are shifting towards diets that require more animal products. And here I'm showing the increase not only in an increase in the global production of animal products, both in terms of feed-fed and grass-fed livestock production, and also there is an increase in per capita consumption, which is associated with a pattern of economic development. As societies become more wealthy, they tend to use more meat. And it takes 4 to 8 times more water to produce 1 calorie of animal products with respect to 1 calorie of plant products. And so if you look at the possible estimates of this increase in demand, just the shift in diet would is expected to lead to a 20% increase in per capita water footprint by the year 2050. And then in recent years, there has been also an increase in demand for agricultural products and for water required to produce these products for biofuels. All the biofuels we use currently in for vehicle transport are first generation biofuels. Basically, they are food crops that are used for the production of energy. And since we are talking about energy, we can look now at the energy we can look at the water demand for energy production, and we look in particular at the blue water, and we see that that energy production is just a tiny fraction of the total water consumption by human societies. Global irrigation is much more than that, so this again confirms the fact that the big player is still the food system. But locally, energy production can require an important amount of water. And so here on the right, I'm showing the breakdown of the different components of this blue water demand for energy. And you can see the biofuels are still are already a big fraction. Biofuels are just a small fraction of the energy consumption. But at the same time, they use a substantial amount of water. Fossil fuels appear to be smaller, but this is partly due to the fact that the water footprint of fossil fuels is usually calculated by looking at the water required for the extraction. But we should also keep in mind that these fossil fuels are derived from biomass that was produced thousands of years ago. And so this biomass for its production required water. We are unable to estimate exactly what the exact amount of water required back then, but because the climate was different, we don't even know what contributed to the formation of these fossil fuels. But if we use some simple rules of replacement of fossil fuels with biofuels, we can find out that the amount of water required to produce these fuels would be of the same order of magnitude as the terrestrial evapotranspiration. So the red arrow shows a number that is more or less similar to the number circled in red in the water cycle figure. So this tells us that we are burning water from the past, we're using ancient water, and that the current energy needs of human societies could not be met by the water cycle if we were to rely on renewable fuels. This suggests again that there is the need to rely on renewable energies that are more like solar or wind, that are not based on fuels. But the projections for the near future is that for the next 50 years, there will be still an increase in reliance on fossil fuels. Part of them will be from unconventional fossil fuels like the oil sands or the shale oil and shale gas. This figure shows a global map of the shale deposits around the world. Some of them are developed mainly in the United States and Canada, and partly also in China. And others might be used in the future, but we can see that the development of some of these deposits will be or might be limited by the availability of water resources. Many of them are located in arid regions of the world, where the development of these deposits would enter in competition with other uses, particularly with agriculture. Many of them, 30% of these deposits, are in areas where agriculture is irrigated. Then, if we switch back to the production of food, there is the need to increase food production to meet the increasing need by the increasing human populations. And then the ecologists tend always to advocate for an approach that is based on the intensification of agriculture. So the intensification of agriculture on currently cultivated land by closing the yield gap, the gap between actual and potential yields in each point around the world. And to close the yield gap, we need to, in many cases, we need to irrigate the land. So the question we have tried to approach is whether there is enough water to close the yield gap. So if we look at just the yield gap maps around the world, we can we find out that we can feed 4 billion people more by closing the gap. But then in some regions of the world, this would engender the conditions of water stress. So here I'm showing in blue areas where irrigation is currently sustainable, in red where irrigation is currently unsustainable, and then there are other areas where irrigation could be expanded in currently rain-fed regions, and in green is where this can happen sustainably, in yellow where it would be unsustainable because it would deplete either the groundwater or environmental flows. So we would dry out rivers. And so with this, we can expand agriculture on 26% of the currently rain-fed areas, increase production of food by 37%, and feed an additional 2.8 billion people. Then in some regions of the world, there are conditions of chronic water scarcity, so there aren't enough water resources to produce the food that is needed locally. And this and the way the local populations are sustained is through imports of water. And virtually by importing water, we import, these countries import, by importing food, they import water resources. So the notion of virtual water is, refers to this idea that the imports of food commodities is associated with an import of virtual import of water that is not physically present in these commodities, but is virtually transported with them. Just to highlight the conditions of water dependency on and dependency on water resources exist in other regions of the world. So the intensification of trade in the last 20-30 years has led to more than doubling of the virtual water fluxes around the world, and also the number of connections in this virtual water trade network, with an increasing involvement of South America, Brazil, and Argentina in this trade. And we can see here the flows of virtual water from Argentina and Brazil to Southeast Asia. This virtual water trade corresponds to 25% of the water used for food production. There are other forms of globalization of water that are associated with international land investments. One of the effects of recent food crisis has been the lack of reliability of the global food market, because there have been conditions of instances of export bans by some of the big food producing countries in the world, because of the need to or desire to limit the escalation of food prices domestically. This has led some other countries and corporations to invest in agricultural land in areas of the developing world where there were still very relatively big yield gaps. And associated with this acquisition of the land, there is an acquisition of water, which is often the real motivator of these investments. So we can see that the idea of intensifying agriculture has some positive aspects, because it prevents the expansion of agriculture at the expenses of grasslands or forests. But it has also some negative aspects, because in some areas of the world, the intensification of agriculture would lead to erosion of or depletion of environmental flows and groundwater. It would not be sustainable from the point of view of water resources. It has also some negative aspects when it favors the transition from small-scale farming to large-scale commercial agriculture through these land acquisitions or other forms of investments that lead to this transition, because they can compromise rural livelihoods. And many times, regions of the developing world where there are big yield gaps are regions where there has not been the financial or institutional capacity to make the investments in modern technology to increase the yields. But advocating for the closure of the yield gap often implies a transition from small-scale subsistence farming to large-scale commercial agriculture. And an alternative to these approaches would be a sustainable intensification. There has been in the literature an increasing interest in other measures that could increase production without requiring investments in advanced technology. So, for example, we can redistribute crops and plant the right crops in the right place without reducing crop diversity and without reducing other nutritional properties associated with these different alternative agricultural landscapes. We can, in alternative, we can improve the crop water productivity, or we can promote an increase in the efficiency of irrigation water uses. Or on the other side, we can reduce consumption by minimizing waste, or reducing the intake of meat and animal calories. So by redistributing crops more efficiently, it's possible to feed an additional 800 million people and reduce the water use by 12%. So this is a measure that would not require advanced technologies, just a more efficient use of resources by using the right crop in the right place. Instead, if we want to reduce the waste, there is still some studies report that food waste is between 25 and 30%. And so there is clearly the possibility to save a lot of resources, including water resources, by reducing the food waste. And we can look at some models of production that are based on the notion of the circular economy, where instead of having a linear pattern of production, which is based on extraction of resources and accumulation of waste, some of the waste is reused in different forms in a way that we can use resources more efficiently. And nature does that through the global biogeochemical cycles. The resources are recycled. So we can look at some ideas that came up. It's not that these are going to be applicable at the global scale, but there has been ideas of using waste to produce insects that are then used as feed for livestock, or other ideas that instead require more advanced technology, like like aquaponics, combining the growth of crops in water instead of soils, and the use of water that is combining this with a fish tank with a aquaculture, so water with the organic matter from fish excrement would be pumped and so rich in nutrients is pumped in the upper tank shown in this picture. And of course, we need bacteria to mineralize these nutrients. So these are just some examples, and I need to conclude just by saying that water remains a major constraint on the production of food and energy. Some countries are in conditions of chronic water deficit. This has led to the globalization of water, mostly through trade. There is a phenomenon that is happening around the world, this transition from small-scale farming to larger-scale commercial agriculture. This is could allow for an increase in the production of food, but has an impact on rural livelihoods. And I was presenting the idea of sustainable intensification as a way to reduce, to increase production, but without necessarily affecting the sustainable use of water resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. Next, I will turn it over to Jenny.
Okay, can you all see that? Is my screen showing here?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. So the point of this presentation is to give an example of what this looks like at the regional scale. So we're looking at the Columbia River Basin in the US and along the Canada, part of it in Canada. And so this is a project funded from the Innovations at the Nexus of Food, Energy, Water Systems, co-sponsored by NSF and USDA with team members from Washington State University, University of Idaho, Utah State, University of Utah, and the Pacific Northwest National Lab. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the framework that we're using that will enable some of these changes, global change and few connections, what we can do to enable decision-making, both from policy and individual decision-making. I won't have much time to show results today, but I just want to present the framework here. So the Columbia River Basin is an ideal test bed for few. It's highly managed with a large diversity of water users. We have our #1 consumptive use is irrigation, and so a lot of irrigated agriculture, dryland agriculture as well. A lot of hydropower generation. There's a lot of water flowing through the system, and we have a lot of both storage dams and run-of-the-river dams. We have enough power to power 13 different Seattles, and we produce about 40% of the hydropower in the entire U.S. We also have a lot of flood control, flooding issues in the basin, and our dams are used for flood control, and we are also home to 4 endangered salmon species. One issue that we're worried about in the Columbia River Basin is that we don't actually have a lot of dam storage, reservoir storage compared to other basins. And so there's a lot of water flowing through the system, but we don't have a lot of storage to buffer impacts of changes. And so our reservoir storage is less than half of our average annual discharge, and along with that, we're losing our natural storage of water. So with warming, we're quite worried about our snowpack declining, and we really rely on our snowpack because our precipitation is winter dominant, but we use a lot of that water in the summertime. So we rely on the snowpack to store up that water in the winter, release it in the summer for water use in the summer. So we're losing that snowpack. So our goal for this project is to identify what strategies for focusing on solutions can co-balance benefits between food, energy, and water sectors, but also increase resilience across the entire integrated system. And related back to losing storage in the system, our hypothesis is that if we look at all of the ways that distributed storage, both of water and energy, occurs in the system, a lot of times they're independently managed. This isn't the case. We do have a lot of the dams along the Columbia Mainstem that are not independent, but there's a lot of other types of floodplain or aquifers, energy storage that's independently managed. So the idea is that if we move towards a more coordinated management of all of these distributed water and energy systems, that basically we have an overall increase in effective storage and an ability to better buffer impacts like, different like droughts and things like this, floods. So the other thing we're doing is looking at innovation with both technology and institutions. And so if we look at the food, energy, water nexus through time, before industrialization at the farm scale, you would think of food, energy, and water all being managed at the farm scale by the farmer. And so it's a very integrated system. But after industrialization, these were more or less pulled apart. So you have water managers, you have agriculture producers, you have the energy system managers. And so these became much less, kind of individual systems. And as climate change, population growth, these different management sectors became more complex, they have begun to overlap more and more, and we expect that to happen more in the future, so that these systems really can't be managed in isolation. Otherwise, you result in lose-lose-win or win-lose-lose situations. So the idea is that how can we use coordinated management of storage systems? How can we use innovation to try to move towards solutions that really prioritize all three of them, to moving towards this win-win-win situation? So that's what we're trying to look at here. So an overview of our approach, we have aims that span from theoretical all the way through very applied to on our stakeholder engagement piece. So with the theoretical work, we're trying to understand what is unique about the system, what is not unique about the Columbia River Basin, so that we can generalize this to national and global scales. With aim 2, we're integrating state of the science models to basically uncover new scientific information about how the food, energy, and water systems interact. And already we're discovering some really interesting things that we didn't know about when water scarcity is felt. Some of this we're seeing early season. We're worried about late season. We have been in the past, but we're seeing some early season water scarcity that has to do with that we couldn't uncover without looking at this system in an integrated way. In aim 3, this is where we start looking at the solutions. And again, we're looking at different ways to coordinate management of water and energy storage systems. We're looking at the different innovations using these modeling platforms. And then finally, we have a robust stakeholder engagement that's ongoing with representative stakeholders across the region. We're identifying and developing new management strategies. We're using them to prioritize which innovations we want to simulate the impacts to, and we want to use them to try to understand what the barriers are to adoption of some of these different solutions. What we're looking at as one of our products, which we're hoping to use for decision support, is something called the Sustainability and Resilience, or STAR, assessment calculator. And our team, after much conversation, realized, it's not all about resilience. We really need to look at sustainability and resilience. Sustainability is really kind of looking at the mean state over time, with resilience is more of a variance, or looking at how it responds to perturbation. And so we did a team building exercise and came to a consensus on how we define what sustainability means across an integrated FEW system, and what that means across an integrated, what resilience means across the integrated FEW system. So we came to a consensus that a FEW system is sustainable if it maintains and enhances environmental health, economic viability, and social equity within the integrated FEW system for current and future generations. So very similar to other sustainability definitions, but you can't have a sustainable FEW system if all of the different components are not sustainable. Resilience, again, is a system property that describes the tendency of a FEW system to maintain structure and functions following perturbation. So what we're trying to build with this calculator is we have indicators for FEW sustainability and resilience. We have indicators in water, energy, and food. And so we're building these, these really commonly used flower charts where, you want to have these indicators as large as possible. So you might have an example. This is all hypothetical here, of a system that's managed with prioritizing water. And so you might have, good indicators for water, but fairly poor for energy and food. Well, if we can start looking at coordinated management of storage in a way that benefits all the sectors, you might be able to balance those out. But we were really looking towards innovation to then be able to expand the sustainability and resilience across all of those FEW sectors. So we've done some team brainstorming. This is from our last annual meeting in May. We're still fairly early in the project, just brainstorming what all of these indicators could be. And so we've done this across food, energy, and water sectors. We do this across an environmental, economic, and social equity aspects of sustainability. We're starting to bring these to our stakeholders to figure out which ones actually would inform decision making that we want to include into our STAR calculator. One thing I want to mention on this slide, this is a team effort. Our team is very interdisciplinary. We have experts across all three food, energy, water sectors, and we've really fleshed out environmental, economic, and social equity expertise. So I think this is a really good example of a convergence research, which is, and it's something that NSF has been really pushing lately. And we have PhD students sitting pretty much within all of these different boxes. Okay, this is related to our aim too, the frameworks. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we have two existing Earth system models, BioEarth, which was developed here at WSU, focused on the food-water nexus, and then the PRIMA model, developed at Pacific Northwest National Lab, not far from here, focused on water energy nexus. So we're combining these to be able to look at the full food nexus. This is a very computationally intensive, distributed in space, distributed in time, mechanistic modeling platform that therefore is rather clunky, so we expect there to be some realism in how it behaves with response to perturbation, but it's hard to run a lot of scenarios, and it's hard to bring in new types of stocks and different storage pieces when we want to look at. So its strengths are it's mechanistic, its weaknesses, it's computationally intensive, it doesn't represent all stocks and flows that we want to look at for our solutions. So we're combining it with system dynamics modeling, where it's much easier to capture different stocks and flows. We can look at floodplain storage, we can better look at all kinds of solutions with the groundwater, maybe on-farm storage or grid scale energy storage. Its weakness, of course, is that it lacks the mechanisms and spatial explicit aspects of the other platforms. So we're doing two-way interaction where we use the integrated modeling platform to calibrate relationships between the stocks. And then we use the system dynamics platform to inform which scenarios, special scenarios that are really could maybe we want to hone in on for the more computationally intensive framework. So in application of these models to look at solutions, we have three types of runs we're doing. One is we want to establish the baseline. So what are the current food, energy, water friction points? And again, we're finding some things that we didn't know about what those are under current climate, current climate and current status quo in terms of management. We want to then look at response to global change and autonomous adaptation. So if we just look at management status quo and then we look at global change, we want to know how that will exacerbate. And in some cases, we're seeing alleviation. It's alleviating some of these friction points and creating new pressure points. So we're looking at exogenous changes, climate change, increases in carbon dioxide, land use, land cover change using downscaled global change assessment model, GCAM model simulations. Where you're looking at changes in population, the industry is changing especially around the Columbia River with all of the energy that we have there. And then the demands for food, energy, and water, both within the basin and then trade with other regions. We then want to bring in autonomous few decision makers. And this is because there's automatic adaptation that's going to happen to this global change that may or may not be good for the integrated few system. So some of these are, in the food sector, we have irrigation technology and management. More efficient irrigation technology is actually causing some negative consequences to the system as a whole, but some positive as well. And we have a paper that we're about ready to submit on this topic. The planting date being earlier, a different crop mix, expansion of crop mix. Double cropping is a really good example where the farmers can make use of that longer growing season by first putting in a crop, harvesting it, planting a totally different crop in that same season and harvesting it. And while this is an adaptation to climate change, it's also making them more vulnerable to climate change and making other water users more vulnerable as well, because they're going to be using that water later in the season when maybe they haven't used it before. And so that's using their water rights. And so they might be more vulnerable in that season to interruption of their water right, and they're making other water users more vulnerable because they're using the water when maybe they haven't in the past. Energy changes, there is increasing non-hydro renewable energy, which is great, but it really changes how the hydropower dams are operated in ways that the dam operators often don't know how to deal with. It changes how we optimize energy dispatch. In water, we are always, there's changes in dam operations with global change, new in-stream flow rules, often for water quality purposes, water rights expansion, which can really increase a few friction points as well. Finally, we explore solutions targeted at the few nexus. We have three sets. First, of course, is this coordination of storage, of water and energy storage. How can we coordinate this to reduce current or future pressure points? How can we bring in innovation and technology in our institutions to reduce these friction points? And then how does the coordination of storage and innovation combined to affect how we can manage this system? So our team has also done brainstorming on all of the different technological and institutional innovations and different ways to manage storage in the system, and we've brought these to the stakeholders, and we've been kind of refining these over time. So I'll just go over some of the smaller set of options that we're zoning in on. And one, with coordinated storage management, we're zoning in on looking at aquifers and using that groundwater as a way to store that water. We have a lot of, period of time when we have a lot of water coming through the system, which is why we worried about flooding. And then a period of time where we need that water for our use. So if we can use the groundwater to do that, that would be great. Pumped hydropower, again, this is time when you have a lot of excess water. So you pump it, up to some higher reservoir and store it there as an energy storage, really, even though it's stored as water, and then release it later when you need that additional hydropower when there's not enough water. Floodplain storage, how can we better make use of our floodplains? On-farm storage, too, is another example of that. Some institutional changes. Water markets are pretty nascent in much of Washington State, not so much in Idaho, but how can we better use water markets to really do a better job of reducing friction points with the few. International policy, we're in the process of renegotiated the Columbia River Treaty, and this is much more complicated than it was when it was first established. We have to consider the tribes, for example. We have to consider salmon. We can't go in and put in dams that would shut off the migration of salmon upstream. What about using smart metering and shaping the demand of energy so that users will use energy at a time when energy prices are low or when there's plentiful water? On the technological side, what about grid scale energy storage? Greenhouses is something that we're moving forward, and as commercial greenhouses across the landscape where you can control the environment. Very low consumptive use. You can recycle the water within the greenhouses. You can use LEDs to control the sunlight. And that gets into precision agriculture, maybe new crop varieties. So those are some of the solutions we're moving forward on. And this provides many opportunities for informing decision-making from policy to individual scales. So global policy are the scenarios that we're getting from the Global Change Assessment Model, which looks at the effects on land use and land cover change from different climate policies, as we can then downscale those using some different rules and see what that looks like across the food, energy, water nexus in the Columbia River Basin. As you expand biofuels, for example, what is the implication for food production? What is the implication for water resources? International policy, I mentioned the Columbia River Treaty. We can do a better job of looking at trade-offs. Federal agencies there's a lot of federal agencies who are managing the dams along the Columbia main stem. How can they, and a lot of them are already coordinated to somewhat, but how can they better make use of other types of storage in the system? State and local agencies, we are doing scenarios around expansion of water rights. We're doing scenarios and work on water markets and development of non-renewable energy sources. Individual entities, we do a lot of work for farmers here. We have a strong extension network, and we are working very closely with many different farmers to try to understand both what their decisions, how that impacts the food system, and then how can they make decisions that are actually win for them and win for the other sectors. And then, of course, our work will potentially inform technology development. We're focusing on commercial greenhouses, but also on grid scale energy storage. So some ongoing contributions from this project. Just a reminder for those who aren't as familiar with the MFUSE program, it is use-inspired basic research with an emphasis on the scientific contribution, but also the potential to be able to inform decisions. So on the scientific side, we're coming up with operational definitions of resilience for modeling the FEW nexus and sustainability. We're developing mechanistic understanding of connections across these systems. We have tools, a generalizable approach. These models and tools we're developing are transferable to other scales and other regions. And then the decision-making context, which is the focus of this presentation. Again, we can quantify the effects of exogenous and autonomous changes in the system and their interactions and how that affects the FEW system. We can quantify the effectiveness of very specific technological and institutional innovations by basically plugging them into the system dynamics modeling framework or plugging them into the integrated modeling framework and looking to see how that alleviates or maybe exacerbates these few friction points. And then we can provide modeling insights that inform policies to incentivize development and use of beneficial technologies. So I'll just end there. I just want to thank everybody. This is just showing a picture of one of our recent tours of Rocky Reach Dam.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny. And now I will turn it over to Lauren to kind of talk about how some of these issues are playing out in Washington, D.C.
Great. Thanks, Brittany, and thank you to AGU for inviting me to participate in this webinar today. So I'm going to quickly touch on some perspectives in Washington around the water, energy, food nexus, focusing mostly on the White House, also Congress. So I thought I would start off with just giving a bit of, why is the National Groundwater Association so interested in this topic? So we represent about 10,000 members across the country committed to the management, use, and protection of groundwater resources. So as the previous two panelists have clearly demonstrated, irrigation and agriculture is a big angle for the West issue, water, energy, food nexus, as well as for groundwater. 53.5 billion gallons of groundwater are used daily for irrigation, and 65% of all groundwater withdrawals in the U.S. are for irrigation. So as we become more and more reliant on groundwater for irrigation, we've also got to think about the energy impacts of that. In a state like California, you've got 19% of all energy costs being paid basically to move water around the state. And as you rely more and more on groundwater, it costs more and more to pump. It takes more energy to pump that water from deeper below the Earth's surface. So looking ahead to the Washington side of things, despite the fact that across all three measures, water, energy, and food, with demand projecting to increase significantly by all estimates, the focus has really been shifting here in Washington over the past few years, particularly in the White House. Over the past couple of years, rather than focusing on things like renewable energy and energy efficiency, as we've seen in previous administrations, this administration is focusing more on traditional means of energy production. We've seen climate change and its effects minimized across federal agencies. And when you look at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, which had previously had a water, energy, food nexus task force, that task force was not renewed when it expired in February of 2017. And the Office of Science and Technology Policy is still waiting on having its top science advisor, Calvin Drogemeyer, confirmed. So that office, which kind of leads a lot of this debate, has been operating with a skeleton crew for the past couple of years. So one of the easiest ways in Washington to get a handle on where the White House's priorities are with the annual budget process. So every year in February, the president will submit the priorities for the White House for the next fiscal year in terms of funding. This is largely a messaging document, and despite who's in the White House, it is most often ignored by Congress, who, kind of takes it and leads it. They did it previously in the Obama administration, and so far we've seen them also ignoring the budget proposals by the Trump administration, and just viewing them more as, suggestions and outlines of where the White House's priorities are, but Congress still maintains that power of the purse go their own way. That being said, it does highlight where some of the priorities are on water, energy, food nexus related programs. So, for example, the Trump's budget proposal for fiscal year 2019 proposed a 70% cut to the Infuse program. This is the program that Jennifer was just talking about that is funds research. It's a National Science Foundation USDA program. So the White House suggested cutting that by 70%. We've seen both the House and Senate bills, including funding levels fairly comparable to last year's funding as well. I should say with a caveat, all of these House and Senate figures are still up for debate as the appropriations process is underway and needs to be wrapped up one way or another by the end of September. So these are where we think things are going to go as of today. Similarly to Infuse, Trump's fiscal 2018 budget justification suggested eliminating the WaterSense program. WaterSense is an EPA program that provides incentives for things like more efficient irrigation, water efficiency programs, and the Trump administration suggested eliminating that program, saying it was duplicative of other existing programs. But thankfully, the House and Senate both included continued support of WaterSense in their appropriations bill so far. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight Trump's budget justification for fiscal year 19 also proposed significant cuts to the U.S. Geological Survey budget. The U.S. Geological Survey has a lot to do with various aspects of the water, energy, food nexus. So we were happy to see the House and Senate either increase or maintain support for several programs within USGS that support water, energy, food nexus efforts like the Landsat program, the National Water Census, the National Groundwater Monitoring Network, all important research that USGS does that help us be informed about West Nexus. So that's kind of the White House angle of things, but I wanted to take a closer look at what's been going on in Congress. There hasn't been a real concerted effort around the West Nexus in this Congress and previous Congresses. It's certainly nothing new that the attention is not being paid to this issue, so I just wanted to highlight a few reasons why that may be the case. The first, I think it's very difficult to get a lot of energy and attention and concerted effort around an issue that has tremendous regional disparities. So as you can see from this map from the National Resource Defense Council, this just shows reliance on groundwater by county. So as we've seen in issues like drought, if drought's not happening in your area, it's very difficult to get somebody, fired up to try to fix it at a national level. So we've got 535 elected officials here in Washington who all need to come together around moving water, energy, food nexus legislation forward, and they really need to be more effective in finding ways to make it impact every congressional district across the country, and that hasn't been done yet. I think next up, one of the challenges is that Congress is not great at multitasking. Like I mentioned before, we are scrambling to get the annual appropriations process done here by the end of September. Congress tends to be a one-issue type organization. So, you're seeing them struggle just reauthorizing the Federal Aviation Administration. Infrastructure is kind of a one-issue challenge that's not yet been resolved. We've seen this with the energy bill and the farm bill. So when they're struggling to get concerted comprehensive legislation on one issue done, how do you really see something as complex and multifaceted as the water, energy, food nexus moving forward? And kind of compounding that is, who does Congress put in charge? And like I had said previously, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy has played this role and taking the lead, but when Congress is crafting legislation, who do they really see as the federal agency that should be the lead on this, or which few federal agencies should be the lead on this? And then similarly, that causes challenges because any piece of legislation has to go through the committee process, and when you've got multiple issues falling under multiple committees' jurisdiction, that really gums up the works quite a bit and slows things down. But with all that being said, I don't want to be too overly negative and to check out just a few opportunities that we've got in the last few months of the 115th Congress that could make some strides on the West Nexus. So the first is the Farm Bill. Both the House and Senate have been working feverishly over the last few months on trying to get a Farm Bill passed by the end of September. Within the Farm Bill, there are programs like the Environmental Quality Incentive Program and the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, both which provide a broad range of incentives to farmers and co-ops to invest in energy efficiency programs, soil health programs, and water conservation. So both House and Senate legislation deal with these programs differently, but we were glad to see that in the Farm Bill they are receiving support one way or another. So we are hopeful that they will receive strong and full funding when a Farm Bill is finally completed by Congress. Secondly, so the energy bill has been something that's been bubbling about for the last 3 to 4 years. There's been this comprehensive effort by Senator Lisa Murkowski and Senator Maria Cantwell to have a bipartisan comprehensive energy bill, which hasn't happened in quite some time. So currently in Congress there is S-1460, the Energy and Natural Resources Act of 2017. Within this legislation, there is a few sections of what's called the News Act, which would create an interagency committee led by DOI, Department of Interior, and the Department of Energy to coordinate research, promote information exchange, and promote public-private partnerships. Granted, this legislation does not address the food aspects of WEF, but it does start to get people talking about these issues. In terms of the fate of this legislation, it's not great considering the tight timeline the Senate has with the election and just a few months left in this Congress, but this bill was able to kind of supersede the committee process and it's ready for the Senate floor as soon as they can find time for it to get on the Senate floor. So I think the likelihood of something like this getting done this Congress is slim, but it's good to see this legislation out there and being discussed and being supported by the chair and ranking member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And the last legislation I just wanted to quickly touch on is the Water Resources Development Act, called the WRDA bill. This is biennial legislation that supports large-scale infrastructure projects. It's predominantly an Army Corps of Engineers bill, supporting things like dams and reservoirs navigation. But this year, both the House and Senate have legislation that would address some aspects of the water, energy, food nexus. The House legislation, of course, includes a provision to support integrative water resources management, where they'll evaluate these proposals on a number of factors, including efforts to support aquifer recharge. And the Senate legislation initiates study into the WIFIA program. The WIFIA program is an innovative financing program for large-scale water projects. One of the projects that's eligible to receive this innovative financing are managed aquifer recharge projects. So the Senate would, in their legislation, authorize this program at $100 million per year, which would hopefully go a long way in leveraging financing for some of these large-scale water projects like managed aquifer recharge projects. And this is another bill that is set to expire, so Congress needs to deal with it and has been working quickly and in a bipartisan manner to hopefully wrap something up and get it signed into law by the end of the year. So with not a whole lot of activity on this topic in Congress, I did want to touch on some of the opportunities outside of the Beltway. As we've seen quite a bit with the federal government dragging its feet on one way or another, we're seeing states step in to really take the lead and serve as policy laboratories. A lot of the ideas that some of the states are putting forward to manage or research challenges with the water, energy, food nexus, we're seeing those then being taken to the federal level on a range of issues. Similarly, we're seeing businesses realize the potential cost savings for managing the water, energy, food nexus, and they're conducting their own research and studies. Businesses like Anheuser-Busch and Lockheed Martin are two that come to mind that have really been active on promoting the need to better manage this water energy food nexus. And I'd similarly put in that boat utilities. Utilities as well are realizing the benefits of promoting energy efficiency and water efficiency around this idea of water energy food nexus. The international community has been consistent in pushing for forward progress, whether it's organizations like the United Nations or the International Institute of Sustainable Development. They're really continuing to lead the way. And lastly, as we've heard from our previous two panelists, research institutions, academia, and the nonprofit community are playing a very important role in conducting research and promoting that research so that better decisions can be made at the federal level, hopefully in the near future. And that's all I have, so I thank you all very much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauren. So we do have a couple of questions that we're going to get started with, but please feel free to ask questions in the chat box as well.
Great. Yes, we have our first question. I guess we can start with directed to Paolo. What are the positive incentives to avoid the externalities of cheap water, cheap energy, contamination of soil in rivers and aquifers by agriculture?
Yeah, so I missed the first part of the question. What are the incentives?
What are the positive incentives to avoid the externalities of cheap water, cheap energy, contamination of soil in rivers and aquifers by agriculture?
Yeah, I think right now there aren't many incentives to do that. There are many incentives to avoid these cheap externalities. One of the big problems is that is often debated is that water is never part of the evaluation of the cost in the production of food. Water is often taken for granted, and so there is no real incentive to reduce the water or the use of water to produce food in a more efficient way.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
I mean, there's a few examples that do come up, though. At least I'm thinking of our region here. If the tillage, moving towards no-till can be a positive incentive to to try to reduce erosion and loss of sediment, which can then cause a lot of water quality concerns downstream. More efficient use of fertilizers is also good for, so no-till is good for farmers because it can retain both organic matter in the soil and water and retain moisture. You also have more efficient use of fertilization, maybe through precision agriculture, which would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as nitrate contamination to both surface and groundwater systems. Establishing water markets can be a very win-win situation between irrigators and other water users, because there's a framework for the irrigators to sell to lease their water rights during times of drought, and so maybe it goes to more high value use during that time, or maybe the nonprofits can buy that water during that time. So there's lots of mechanisms at a smaller scale to do that. I'm guessing that maybe that question is focused more at the kind of the larger scale policy scale, but there are win-win opportunities.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question is for Jennifer. Can you discuss some mitigation measures, given that dependency on the snowpack for water storage is definitely going to be broken in the very near future?
Okay, so this is pretty much at the heart of what we're trying to do. So some of these solutions, particularly around the coordination of storage, is getting right at that. So in some places, it makes sense to do aquifer storage and recovery or managed aquifer recharge, where you You can either pump water into during the winter time when you have all of this water available, because the problem with the snowpack is that the precipitation, which is actually projected probably to increase, we don't know that well, but maybe increase at the annual scale, and mostly in the winter time, we do have the water, it's just not coming at the right time. So how can we store that water in different ways than in the snowpack? And so can we store it in the groundwater through managed aquifer recharge, where we have kind of these ponds where we want to infiltrate down into the groundwater in places where we really need that water later in the summer? Can we make better use of pumped hydropower? Can we make better use of on-farm storage? There are some of the water rights don't allow the farmers to build their on-farm storage, but there are some places where they do, and that really reduces their vulnerability to drought. So that is really right at the heart of what we're trying to do there. Maybe better use of floodplains. So, maybe we could set back levees and make better. I know there's a lot of research going on and elsewhere where they're looking at at different ways to use floodplains to do that. So I would say that's my response to that one.
Hi, great. We have another question. This is from Natasha in Mozambique. Any insights into the effects of fires and changing fire regimes on the food, energy, water nexus? Paolo, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, there are some aspects. So clearly, fires play an important role in the dynamics of rangelands, and so the suppression of fires has often the impact of favoring the encroachment of woody plants at the expenses of grasslands. So that's one of the aspects. Then, and this affects many regions of the world, clearly. Then the wildfires, of course, also affect agricultural land and the areas adjacent to agricultural land. So, and clearly that the spread of fires across the cropland has the impact of causing the loss of crops. This happened in some of the recent food crises where there were really wildfires, I think in 2008. So if fires affect a large region, this would be the impacts.
Okay, great. It looks like we don't have any more questions. Are there any other questions? Please put them in the chat. Looks like that's it for questions, but thanks everyone again for joining us. Thanks, of course, to all our speakers. And sorry about the little technical difficulties in the beginning, but we will be sending a recording of the webinar as well as the slides around to everyone. And thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Yeah.